All right, so the first thing that I would like to let everybody know that is I have muted everyone. And the reason for this is to avoid any disruptions throughout the webinar. You are, however, more than welcome to ask any questions in the chat function. At the end of this webinar, we are going to open the platform for any questions whereby I can unmute you or you can unmute yourself, but this will only happen at the end. If you would like to activate your audio, you can just do so in the left-hand corner. There would be a mute icon with a microphone. You can just click on it and it will give you a message to say something like, the host has muted you, request to be unmuted, something similar to that. And at the end of this webinar, you will have the ability to unmute yourself then. There's also the option of not showing your video. However, this is truly only up to you. The only reason why I do suggest turning off your video is that if everyone's video is on, it's going to take a lot of data. So if your video is off, or the more people who have their video off, in the end will then add to the data that we can spare. All right, so we are supposed to be a full house today. We are sitting at 121 participants. We have a total of 300 registrants for this webinar. However, due to connectivity, I'm sure a few of you might, in this process, be either kicked off Zoom. And if you do kicked off, you can just, on your own, link back to the Zoom application. If you do feel that you have missed information, you do not have to worry because we are recording this webinar. And in the end, let's say tomorrow or on Thursday or Friday, we will send this link to everyone and you will be able to download this webinar. Therefore, you can backtrack and see, for instance, if there was anything that you have missed. If you have any colleagues, please refer them to our social media. We are going to host another free webinar. The information will be available on our social media pages such as Facebook. And for instance, other workshops and webinar and whatever Liminal is busy with will be shown on our social media pages. So pop a like, pop a comment, write a review, and this will help us in order to be exposed to more people in this industry, because we know in the research industry, there is a lot of training still needed. We are also going to select a winner who has attended this webinar. So if you have attended, you were required at your registration to say whether you are interested in qualitative or quantitative, and you will then be allocated to a list for a lucky draw. The lucky draw will be recorded and placed on our Facebook page, and the attendee will receive a personal email from us as well. At Liminal, we do not, or we have different services available. So we do have webinars, but we do offer individual online consultations as well. So you can do this by booking an online consultation via the website. And I think somewhere here in my view, you can see the website address. We also have different services available, such as language editing. We also have different services available, such as transcribing your interviews, or for instance, if you have a lot of data to capture, we would be able to assist with that as well. If you are in a company or if you have a large research project that might not be related to, for instance, a dissertation or a thesis, you are more than welcome to contact us as well. And I think that is it with all the logistics for today. So I'm going to move over or give over or hand over to my colleague Henny, where he will start with the quantitative process. All right, Henny, you have the floor now.
Hello, can you hear me? Let me just activate my video. Okay, I cannot activate my video. Monique, can you maybe put it on?
I've just...
Okay. Okay, can you see me? Good morning, everybody.
Perfect.
How are you in the lockdown? I hope you're all fine. Okay, you must just bear with us because there's a lot of logistics here. Yeah, so I will just set up everything. I'm Henny Gerber. I'm a statistician with 20 years of consultation experience at universities working with students. So I will present the quantitative research design part, and it will be, say, about an hour. So let me just try to set up share the PowerPoint here. Monique, if you can answer, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, welcome everybody. Let us start. Okay, as I said, I'm Henny Gerber from Liminal Research Consult, and I will do the quantitative part of the presentation. I have 20 years experience. And then please ask your questions in the chat. Okay, please ask the questions in the chat. After each section, I'll try to answer it, and then afterwards, as Monique said, in 2 hours we'll have an open session. Is that fine with you all? Oh, okay, you cannot answer. Okay. Okay, the content. I'll just what I want to do is I want to give you some sort of an overview here of the process. 1 hour is not enough, so I'll just touch on certain things. So I'll look at the research process, then I'll look at research questions and hypotheses quickly, then the research process, I'll touch on mixed methods here, then research design, then I'll look at questionnaire and especially the scale. I'll focus a bit more on this, the validation of a scale in a questionnaire, then how reliability, then how to choose a valid scale, and then I'll look at a research consistency matrix. Now, please, if you just take one thing from this 1 hour, this research consistency matrix, you must fill this in before you send out a questionnaire, before you conduct your study. That's very, very important. This will help you to align everything in your study and make sure everything is fine. Okay, Monique, everything is fine there? Okay, let me just go on. Okay, this quote, I'll open with this quote. To consult the statistician after an experiment is finished is often merely to ask him to conduct a post-mortem examination. He can perhaps say what the experiment died of. This was Ronald Fisher, a famous statistician. Now, this is actually what it's all about. We don't want to have a dead experiment. So that's what we want to avoid. And that's what we'll want to look at. So we will look at the very important and critical design issues. Okay. So we'll look at the critical steps in the research process. Let us just look at the research process, the diagram of the research process. Okay, step 1, we have the problem discovery. We have the literature study, where you get your theory. The problem discovery is where you have your research questions and the starting point for everything. Then we get to the research methodology. You'll see there's a small figure there, that's the research design, that green board there. Then there's a questionnaire, that's your research instrument that you'll use. And then you'll have a population that you will look at. So that's the three important things we look at there. So that will be the research design, the instrument, and the sampling. And then you gather your data, and then you'll have data analysis. So what we'll do is we will look at the research question or research problem and your research hypotheses. Then we'll look at the methodology, what will be your design. Then the questionnaire, the measuring instrument, it must be valid and reliable. And then there's a certain population you look at. And then you look forward to doing some data analysis. Now, it's very important at this stage to make sure that you will be able to do the data analysis by using this questionnaire that you sent out and looking at that population. You don't want to have a situation at the end that you cannot do your data analysis. Okay. The example I will look at is the technology acceptance model. This is a very simple example. So the theory this person looking at is technology acceptance. So that's when you use new technology, like we're busy here. It's sometimes a struggle. So for technology to be used or to be accepted, if you want to use it, it must be useful. It must be easy to use. And then you'll have the attitude to use it. You want to use it. Now, what this person wanted to do is to bring in another concept, which is called skills. So this person wants to test not only usefulness, ease of use, but skills and bring that in as another construct. Okay. We will look at that further when we go through the process. Okay, let us look at the first part. There's research questions and research hypotheses. So this will guide your research. It's a starting point for your research. And obviously, when you look at your title, this research questions must be linked to the title. It must unpack your title further. Okay, if we look at research questions, now a research question is a bit more broad. So you want to investigate something. So it's not the same as a hypothesis, which is very specific. So the difference between the two is that a research question is more broad. You can have one research question, and then you can have different hypotheses beneath that research question. Okay. Then if you look at a research hypothesis, it's a specific statement that you want to prove or disprove. And so it's very specific, and you must state that statement, and that statement will be tested. So it's very specific. While a research question could be more broad. And then in your research, usually you'll use both. You have your general research question with a few hypotheses, unpacking it, testing it. I'm obviously talking now about the quantitative part when I talk about hypotheses. Okay, if you look at the hypothesis, there's 3 requirements for a hypothesis. Okay, let us start with the first thing. The hypothesis must consist of variables that's measurable. So if you have a hypothesis, there must be variables in it, and it must be measurable. How will you measure it? Quantitatively, you'll measure it in a questionnaire with questions, say usually Likert scale questions. Then it must be testable, that hypothesis. So what I mean by that is you must have some statistical test to test it. Say, for example, if you look at the differences between the salaries of males and females, then you can do a simple t-test. So that would be the test that will test that hypothesis. So you'll use a statistical test for that. And then the third thing is it must be falsifiable. Now, what does that mean? you must be able to falsify the statement, the hypothesis that you make. So we usually have a null hypothesis and then an alternative hypothesis, which is actually the research hypothesis. So your null hypothesis would be the status quo and your research hypothesis would be the alternative. So then when you reject the null hypothesis, say with a statistical test, then the alternative is accepted. Let us just look at the example of a hypothesis. There's an example. There's a null hypothesis. So it says skills that you saw previously in the model have no statistically significant influence on ease of use. So we want to see if you have skills, will it make it easier to use this new technology? So the influence of skills on ease of use. So that's your null hypothesis. The null hypothesis say there's no influence. So the research hypothesis is actually there is a statistically significant influence. Now in statistics, it's a bit of the other way around. So the alternative is the research hypothesis because we want to falsify the null hypothesis. So say for example, we do a look at a simple regression and we do the regression, we see skills have a statistically significant influence on ease of use, then we can reject the null hypothesis. Okay, so that's the requirements of hypotheses. And that's where we start with our research. We have certain hypotheses that we want to prove. Okay, I'll allow now for discussion. Is there any questions on research hypotheses or research questions at this stage? You can let me know in the chat. Monique, if you can maybe come in here. Is there any questions?
So far, no questions. Everything good, thank you.
Okay, there's a question coming in. I'll just answer that quickly. There is, I don't want to go into too much detail, but there's a question about directional and non-directional. So statistically, you can say, say for example, if you test something like there would be a positive relationship, that's a hypothesis, or there's a negative relationship, and then you have a one-sided test, statistical test to do that. So so you can state a positive or a negative hypothesis. That's also possible. Do each question have its own hypotheses? Okay, it depends. It really depends. For statistical analysis to be done, you need to set some sort of hypothesis. And then you do a statistical test on it. But you can have a general research question, for example, and then you can test a model. For example, you can say in your research question, you develop a certain model, and then you look at model fit criteria and that kind of thing. Then it's not a straightforward t-test, p-value that you look at. Okay, null hypothesis. Come again on why the null hypothesis should be stated in the negative. Is there some reasoning to it? Okay, let me just go back to the null hypothesis again. Remember, I said with a hypothesis that it's important to be able to falsify it. That's research. So you need to state something and then you must be able to falsify it. So what we'll do is we'll state the opposite of the research question here. Say skills have no statistically significant influence on ease of use. So what will happen is if we do the statistical test and we found a statistically significant influence, then we reject the null hypothesis. We reject that statement. That's now okay, don't confuse this with qualitative, please. This is when we do a statistical test. I'm talking about statistical tests for hypotheses. Okay.
Kenny,
Yes.
we also have a question to say, can you please further elaborate on the hypothesis examples?
Okay, I'm not sure what examples, the previous ones or this one we're talking about.
I'm not sure.
At the end, okay, let me answer it in this way. At the end of when we work through everything, we look at the model that was presented, and then we will look at the hypotheses that was stated for that model. So let me just, can I just go back to the model quickly? Okay, the model is not stated at this stage with arrows or anything. That will come later, because I don't want to confuse you at this stage, because we must first look at validation. But then in the end, we look at hypotheses that will be answered with this model. But we first need to look at validation. And validation would be that 4 concepts we see there. I hope that's fine. Monique, can you come in there? Is somebody?
Yes.
I
So
have 3 research questions. Do I need 6 hypotheses? Yes.
We have a few questions just with regards to the null hypothesis. What exactly is it that makes a null hypothesis? And is there some reason to it that it should be stated in the negative?
Okay. For any statistical test to be done, you need a null and an alternative hypothesis. So in statistics, you actually cannot prove a hypothesis. You can just disprove something. You cannot prove it. So what you'll do is you'll state your research hypothesis and say skills have a statistically significant influence on use. And then in your data, you will do the statistical analysis, and then with a certain degree of certainty, you will say that you will be able to reject the null hypothesis. But in statistics, you cannot be sure. It's not 100% science like maths, for example. There's always an error in it. And so then we allow for a 5% error. So that's why we work with a 95% level of confidence. So then we can say with 95% level of confidence, we will be able to say that we can reject the null hypothesis. So that's the reason for it. So we want to be very sure that the alternative is true. That's why we want to have a 95% level of confidence. And that's when you do your statistical analysis. So that's why you state your null hypothesis. So if we are not very sure that we can reject the null hypothesis, we'll rather stick with the status quo. We need to be 95% sure. Is that fine? Is that fine with you?
I'm sure the question was answered. We also have another question, yes, from that says, no hypothesis, classroom management strategies has no effect on learner discipline. Oh, sorry. Please advise if the concept has been grasped correctly. I think we can have a look at that question at the end, perhaps.
Yes, that seems fine if I look at it quickly. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time because we need to look at the validation also. Can we move on?
We can continue.
Okay, thank you. Okay, somebody said, shouldn't we use probability? Yes, that's exactly what's happening. So you have a p-value and you have a probability that's linked to your statistical test, and that's why you use that in your null hypothesis. Okay, let me move on. Okay, the next thing. So we have our hypothesis that we want to test. Now, the next thing is we must choose a research approach. So you get quantitative approach and qualitative approach. Just very broadly, if you have a population that you need to investigate and the population is very small, then it will not make sense to go the quantitative route. Then you need to do qualitative anyway. Say, for example, you are investigating in a business and there's only, say, 5 managers. you will not be able to do that part of the research quantitatively. You need to then go qualitative. Now, I just put in a very simple rule of thumb. So if it's less than 50, qualitative, and quantitative, I put the figure 300, but sampling is a very involved issue. There's a lot of criteria involved. You must look at a specific study. Studies can be done with only 100 people for a master's. So it depends on a lot of things. But in general, if you have 300, you can have a very good study quantitatively. But like I said, you can even have 100 that would also work. It depends on a lot of different things. But in general, quantitative needs a lot more data, qualitative much less. Qualitative, you do your interviews. Quantitative, we will send out a survey, a questionnaire for the quantitative part. Now, for the mixed method, you will use both approaches for the mixed method. Now, let me just look, and the mixed method is very valuable, but it's involved and it takes a lot of time. Now, let me just explain this. The mixed method must be done thoroughly, both 100%. So 100% quantitative, do your questionnaire full analysis thoroughly, and then your qualitative interviews thoroughly and your analysis. So both must be done. You cannot just do a little part of it. So say, for example, you do a quantitative study, you send out your questionnaire, you have open-ended questions, and then from the open-ended questions, you take out themes, and you do a content analysis. Then but it's still quantitative, your main approach, with a little bit of qualitative. So you call it qual. Okay, so your main approach is still quantitative. You cannot call it mixed methods. Then the other way around, say you do qualitative, you have 15 interviews. You also get descriptive statistics from the interviews, and you present the descriptive statistics for the 15 people. Then it's still a qualitative approach with a little bit of quantitative added to it, not mixed method. Okay. Now, there's 3 different approaches to the mixed method. The first approach is sequential explanatory. So you do the one method first and then the second method. So in this case, say you have already a questionnaire that's already developed and already valid and reliable. Then you do the quantitative part first. If you look at the green here, the quantitative part first. And then you send out your questionnaire. It's already developed. It's already valid and reliable. You do your statistical analysis, get your trends, test your hypothesis, and then you do the qualitative interviews and the qualitative analysis. And this then could explain what happened here. So this approach is used usually when the questionnaire is valid and you do your quantitative first, and then the qualitative is used to explain that. Then the next approach, this is when you don't have a questionnaire, for example, and it's called a sequential exploratory approach. So you first want to explore. You don't have valid and reliable constructs yet or themes. So you do the qualitative interviews. You use the qualitative interviews to extract themes and develop statements for the questionnaire. And then you send out this questionnaire that you developed here, and you do the quantitative analysis. Okay. But then both these 2 methods takes a lot of time, because you do a thorough quantitative study and then the qualitative, or in this case, qualitative and then the quantitative. But it's very valuable, especially for a PhD. Then the next approach is the concurrent approach. So you do both together. So you do your quantitative data analysis and collection analysis, and the same with the qualitative at the same time, and then you compare and integrate. But what's important here is, remember the example we're looking at. We're looking at technology acceptance. So technology acceptance is your theory. So the technology acceptance consists of ease of use, usefulness, attitude, and skills. And you present skills as a new concept. Now, what I'm talking about here is it's a concept or a construct or a theme, all the same thing, or a factor. It's all relating to the technology acceptance. Now, if you do the quantitative here and you know that's the 4 concepts you want to look at, you must also in the qualitative align this 4 here. This 2 must be aligned. Now, I know it's not perfectly possible always, because say new concepts come out here, then you must just go with it, but you must integrate this 2 or make sure this 2 approaches is related back to your theory and say the 4 things you want to test, if I can call it like that. If not, then you will not be able to integrate it at this stage and compare. And then you do your interpretation. Okay, is there any questions at this stage with the mixed method? Okay, there's somebody to talk about saturation. I think that's Monique's field of the qualitative. So you keep on doing interviews until you reach saturation. But I think Monique will be better to answer that question. Is there any?
I will attach on this later.
Yes, Monique will talk about that later. Is there any questions at this stage about your research approach? The mixed method or the research approach? Okay, can you give us a sample number for the mixed method? Okay, the mixed method, yeah, from the quantitative side, there's a lot of criteria you must look at before you can decide on sample size. It's not straightforward. Please clarify mixed method. Okay, just to clarify it again, the mixed method means you're using 2 approaches together. So you're using qualitative and the quantitative approaches, and then it's called mixed method. So you use 2 methods. If you decide to do a mixed method approach starting with quantitative and then qualitative, are you required to integrate the results after? Yes, in the end, you need to make your conclusions, but the 2 will flow into each other, because say if you start with quantitative, you'll get analysis there, and then the qualitative will what's the English word for it? We'll talk more about it. I cannot get to the word now. Would a concurrent mixed design be good for a descriptive study? Okay, descriptive. Okay, descriptive. Yeah, I think the concurrent would work well with descriptive, because especially if it's a PhD and you have a descriptive study, people don't like descriptive at this stage much, especially from the quantitative side, because you don't do much analysis. So that could work. Is there a link between these methods and the Delphi process? Okay, the Delphi process, I think, is also about developing a questionnaire. But okay, I think that's a bit advanced to talk about that. Can you please explain the difference between explanatory mixed method approach and a study that used quantitative approach with elements of qualitative? Okay. Okay, like I said, with the explanatory mixed method, you start with quantitative thoroughly and you do qualitative also thoroughly. But if you just have a quantitative approach with elements of qualitative, then it would be still quantitative. Okay, questionnaire validation. I'll talk about questionnaire validation next. That's very, very important.
So there's just one more question that we've missed.
Yes.
A link now. What is the difference between triangulation and mixed method?
Okay. Okay, in a sense, mixed method is triangulation, But triangulation, I think, is a bit more than that, because you look at a different, what can you call it? Different, not methods, different parts of the research to or different views to look at the same thing and then get to the same answer at the end. So it's related to triangulation, but not exactly, because triangulation means you can bring in other things also. I don't know if that answered the question.
I think before we move on to the next slide,
yes.
Last question is, if you collect quantitative data from employees and quantitative data from managers, can this be a mixed method? So to answer that question is no, this is not a mixed method. That would be a multi-method, because you are using different forms of quantitative data instead of making use of different forms of quantitative and qualitative data.
Yeah, because the two, you need to use both methods to do your analysis, and if you can't get it from the managers, the same, yeah, that's true. Okay, is there any other questions, Monique?
Not for now, we can continue.
Great. Yeah, I'll just watch the time, but we'll see. Okay, there's a lot, okay, there's different views at different universities, different supervisors. So this is my view, but this is my way to get it, to get a logical explanation for it. There is references to people that use this. Now, if you want to decide on your research design, you can look at your research objective, and then you can say, is your research objective exploratory? And then you can use these two designs. I'm now talking about quantitative, please, not qualitative is not involved now. Then explanatory experimental design. Now there's some people that reason that things like structural equation modeling can be seen as explanatory. So that's a bit of a gray area. Now then, or you can look at, yeah, okay, that's your research objective. Or you can say, what's your goal? Is your goal exploratory or is it explanatory? So say your goal is exploratory, you can use these two methods, or explanatory experimental design. Or then the research objective, you have exploratory research, which is this, or confirmatory research, which is this with the experimental design. So you first look at your goal or your research objective, and then you decide on which of these methods do you research designs, general research designs do you use. Now, if you look at, say, for example, the first one, which is descriptive, I'm not bringing in now looking at time, longitudinal, or all of that. I just keep it very simple at this stage. So descriptive designs is just describing what is going on, the current state of affairs. Now you can do a little bit of statistical analysis with this. Say some t-tests or looking at your biographics and do some statistical analysis, but mainly the aim would be here to describe. So it will be mostly descriptive statistics, although you can do a few statistical tests here. Then for the next one, the correlational research, it's not a correlation, it's referring to relationships. So most people do this kind of research design. So you want to discover relationships among variables. So that's what you're looking at. So your main aim would be looking at the relationships. So if in your title you have something like, I want to look at the influence of this on this, it must be correlational research design. It cannot be descriptive. And then the last one is your experimental design. So you have a proper experiment, and then you can have a questionnaire that is the instrument to get to your data. So in psychology, they do that. They send out a questionnaire as the research instrument, but they still do experimental design. So you do some experiment and you want to see the influence of some intervention or manipulation. And then for that, you can, that's explanatory. Now, in some cases, like I said, they can reason that a structure equation model is explanatory. There's a bit of discussion around that. Okay. Is there any questions on research designs? I see there's something here. Let me just quickly look. Experimental research.
So some of these questions I've already privately.
Okay. Yeah, with the qualitative, Monique can come in there.
I see this. Hi, can an experimental research that is evaluating the effects of one treatment over the other can make use of a qualitative research design? This is also a bit qualitative, so I'll get to that later. Next question is research design the same as study design?
Yeah, you can call it that. Yeah, I think so. What do you say, Monique?
I think so too.
If one is used explanatory mixed method approach of 200 respondents of a survey questionnaire can sample of, okay, the qualitative, Monique must just get to that. Then just to clarify again on experimental research, in a statistical sense, if you do an experiment, then you need to do a proper statistical analysis, if it's in a statistical sense. Okay. Okay, is that fine?
Perfect.
The time is getting caught up with us. Okay. Okay, the questionnaire. The questionnaire is your measuring instrument. Okay, so that's your research instrument. It consists of a series of questions. It can be yes/no questions. It can be scales. I'll get to scales. That's very important. So the scale will consist of constructs and Likert scale items. You can also test knowledge. There's a lot of different things that you can do with questionnaires. I'll just focus at this stage on testing perceptions with scales, just to keep it simple. Okay, a typical questionnaire. You have your biographical information, variables that get your biographical information from your respondents. That's important because you need to know what is this audience, and they are saying certain things, and how what is this audience you're looking at. Then you have your scales that you test your theory from. If you look back at that model we talked about, the technology acceptance model, you have ease of use, you have usefulness, attitude, and skills. So that is your theory, and you'll use a scale to test it. So they talk about, say, things like personality scales. You can have different scales in your questionnaire. So say section B can be one scale and section A is another scale. Now, let me just go to example of a scale. A simple example that everybody can understand is the Myers-Briggs personality scale. So that's a scale, they call it a scale, and the scale is consisting of dimensions, constructs, factors, that's all the same thing, themes. And then, say for example, one of the 16 is the ISFJ, that's the most common personality type, there's 16 of them. So what you need is, if your theory is, say for example, the personality scale, you need to be sure that you have valid constructs. That 16 that you got there, that 16 dimensions must be valid, that constructs or dimensions. And that's very important. That comes in your research methodology. It must be valid and reliable. Now, each of these dimensions here, these 16 dimensions, is tested with a few Likert scale statements. So in your questionnaire, typically, you'll have a few Likert scale statements for each of these dimensions. Okay? You're fine with that? Okay, sorry, you cannot answer. Okay, then in the questionnaire, the scales in your questionnaire that you use, and this scales is now directly linked to your theory that you test, must be valid and reliable. And if that's not true, you cannot do anything further, nothing. Okay, then we prefer a validated scale to use, and we'll look at how can you choose a scale that's already validated. That's your first choice, because then you don't have to do the validation yourself. If that's not true, and you can't get a validated scale that tests your theory, then we can do the first step in construct validation with exploratory factor analysis, and you need a lot of data for that. So that points then again to your sample. So if you don't have much data, then try to rather get a validated scale. Otherwise, you need to go the qualitative route. And then construct reliability. Each of these constructs must be reliable, and we use the Cronbach alpha coefficient for that. There's other measures also like omega they use now, but the Cronbach alpha is the most commonly used at this stage. So that will tell you if that construct is reliable. That's the Cronbach alpha. So getting back to the 16 personality types, the 16 personality types should have been tested with exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory factor analysis, and then the Cronbach alpha coefficient for all 16 should have been 5. Okay. You can use a pilot questionnaire or a pre-test questionnaire to test your reliability here if you're not sure, because you don't need much data to test reliability, but validity, you need a lot of data. So if you need to do that properly, you need to do one study to do validation and another study to do your modeling. Some people do the validation and then just on one set of data, they do validation and then do the modeling. That's not ideal, but people sometimes don't have the luxury to do 2 studies, and then they just go for that route. Okay. Now let us just look at the construct. A construct is a theorized psychological construct. It's a concept. It's also called latent factors, dimensions, themes. That's all the same thing. And that's tested. It cannot be tested directly. So you use a few Likert scale questions to test that. So say, for example, one of the personality types can be tested with a few Likert scale questions, or ease of use can be tested with a few Likert scale questions, and then usefulness and all of that. Okay. Okay, let us look at an example. We look at a technology acceptance scale. So that's ease of use, usefulness, attitude, and skill, which is the new thing that's brought in. But all of that must roll up back to one main construct or one main concept, and that's called technology acceptance. So when you validate, you always validate back to one overall thing. That's very important. So let us look at that. So we have technology acceptance. That's the main construct we're looking at, or the main thing, the scale actually. And this scale consists of these 4 constructs. And we want to be sure this is all valid. Ease of use, usefulness, attitude, and skills. But skills is the new thing we bring in. Now, let me just show you a questionnaire to make more sense of it. I just hope the technology doesn't give us a problem here. Let me just show you the questionnaire. Okay, sorry, I can't get the questionnaire open. What I'll do is, yes.
Can I suggest closing the PowerPoint and then clicking on share screen at the bottom and then clicking on the questionnaire?
Yeah, the share screen is not open. So, okay, what I'll do is I'll go out and go in. If that will just be a bit of a disruption, but I'll just do it like that.
That's fine.
Okay, so if you can just bear with me, please. Okay, can you all see, Monique, is the questionnaire
Yes.
on the screen?
Yes.
No, sorry for that. I've opened it before, but now suddenly, you know, technology, it's gone. Okay. Okay, let us look at this. This is the questionnaire. Okay, so that's about technology acceptance. There's the Likert scale statements, and then there's the different constructs we look at. Ease of use, there's 3 questions, usefulness, skills, and attitude. So that's just a part of the questionnaire or the scale where we test this technology acceptance. Remember, like I said, you can have different scales in your questionnaire because you want to relate this to something else maybe. So in this case, look at ease of use. There's a question, my interaction with the recommender system was clear and easy to understand. I found the recommender system easy to use. So you see, this question is all about ease of use, and then you answer on a 5-point Likert scale. And the same with usefulness. I found the recommended movies attractive. The recommended movies were adequate, and then you have your 5-point Likert scale. And then the same with skills, and the same with attitude. So what you're seeing here is, you see all these questions, all these Likert scale questions form part of the technology acceptance scale. So when we want to validate, we want to validate all of these back to this 4 constructs here when we do the validation statistically. Okay. You're all fine with that? Okay, you cannot answer, sorry. I'll ask questions later. Let me just go to the PowerPoint again. Okay, Monique, see the PowerPoint's on?
Yes, the PowerPoint's on.
Okay, so the validation. What is validity? Validity is, are we measuring what we're supposed to measure? So we're supposed to measure technology acceptance. So we want to make sure, is it all technology, when we look at technology acceptance, is it about ease of use, usefulness, skills, and attitude? And this is your actual theory. So we need to be sure, are we measuring what we're supposed to measure? Now, statistically, we use exploratory factor analysis for that, to see, are we measuring what we're supposed to measure? Is it this 4 constructs that's proposed? Okay. Now, I'll go through this very, very quickly. This is just to give you an idea on how it's done statistically with exploratory factor analysis. Okay, so we have the 19 Likert scale statements. The first step in the exploratory factor analysis would be to decide on how many factors we have, or dimensions. Is it this 4 that we propose, or is it maybe 3, or is it maybe 5? Then we want to see what is this factors now. So that's the 2 steps in the exploratory factor analysis. Then how many factors? Okay, there's a few statistical things I'll tell you now. Don't be too worried about this. I just want to give you the bigger picture. Now, to decide on how many factors, we look at eigenvalues greater than 1. We look at the cumulative percentage of variance greater than 60%. The scree plot, and we can use say something like a parallel plot. Now, I will show you the output, and then it will make much more sense. But what we do is we look at this 4 criteria, or mostly the 3, because in SPSS you don't get a parallel plot. Now, when you look at the criteria, you decide on the number of factors. Now, if you're not sure, and you get one of the criteria tells you that there must be 5 factors, say the eigenvalues, and then the cumulative percentage here tells you it must be 4, you go for the most number of factors. And then you go and interpret it and see if it makes sense, and then you work backwards. Okay, but it will make more sense when we look at the output. Then the second step would be, what is this factors now? And then you look at factor loadings for that. So you look at the absolute value above 0.4. So the factor loadings will tell you where is this question, the Likert scale question, where is it loading, on which factor is it loading? So you use the factor loadings for that. Sometimes it can load onto 2 factors, and then you must make a decision. It's called the cross-loading there. Now, what you're looking for is, when you look at this factor loadings, you're looking for a common theme between that questions that loads, and then come up with that common theme. we look at that, it will make sense when we look at the output of the factor loadings. And then it must be interpretable. That's very, very important. So this must be interpretable according to your research and your theory. And that's very, very important. And it must make logical sense. Okay. Now, again, just to come back, this is when you do it yourself, when you don't have a validated scale or validated questionnaire. Okay, let us look at this. I've put in this in red here because I used the article, and the article didn't have eigenvalues in, and I just imputed the eigenvalues myself by doing some calculations. Okay, so let us look at this here. This factors here is the proposed number of factors that you can get now from this 19 Likert scale questions. Remember, think back about the 4 factors we're looking at for the term scale, the technology acceptance scale. Now, if you look at the first factor here, the eigenvalue must be above 1. So you can see all these eigenvalues is above 1, except this one here. So the 5th factor, so it will, this 5th factor's eigenvalue is 0.76. So if you look at the eigenvalue criteria, we will decide on 4 factors, not 5. But then when you look at the percentage of variance, that's the percentage of variance in your data that's explained by these factors now. So we want to have 60%. So if you look at the percentage of variance explained by this first factor, it's 38.5%. So, and then we look at the cumulative percentage. So when you go down here, we get to 60% already here at 3 factors. But with 4 factors, it's better at 68%. And then it's 76% with 5 factors. Now at this stage, if you look at these criteria here, we will decide on 4 because the eigenvalue is not 1 year for the 5th one. So we'll decide on 4 according to the eigenvalues, and that will give us 68% of the variance. So at this stage, we stick to 4. And then when we look at the scree plot, now the scree plot will just give you a graphical presentation of the eigenvalue. So that's the first one. That's the second factor, 3rd one, 4th one. So we look for an L shape here. So what you see here is that's 1, there's a lot of contribution here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it just levels out. Nothing is happening here. So we can cut it there. Now a scree plot is a little bit difficult to interpret. So you'll get used to it. Now, but in this case, it's quite clear. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it levels out. So according to the scree plot and the cumulative percentage of variance and eigenvalues, we'll decide on 4 factors. And hopefully that's the 4 factors we proposed anyway, or the 4 constructs. Okay. Now we look at the factor loadings here. So remember, this is the questionnaire here, and we got the 4 factors out. There's 4 here. The factor loadings is for each of the questions here. So this is the questions in the questionnaire. These questions here is all questions in the questionnaire. Now this one worked out perfectly, but this is theory that's already done. So that's why it's working out so well. Now, if you look at the first, this is one question about usefulness here. So this question loads onto this factor here, 0.9. So all these are all loading onto this first one. All these are loading onto this one here. Now you will not see the factor loadings in this blank spaces here because the loadings here is suppressed to make it easier to interpret. So you usually suppress, say, loadings below 0.3. So there's still a little bit of loadings here. So, but this is very clear. So these here is forming one factor. This is forming another one, and these, that one, and this one. And then you read through these questions in the questionnaire and you come up with the name. Now in this case, it perfectly fitted because it's already well-established model. But when you do it yourself, it will not always have a perfect fit here. And then what you do is you read through these questions here and see what's the common name. Now in this case, we know this is perceived, this is usefulness. And this is then that attitude, I called it acceptance here. And then perceived ease of use was these questions, and there was skills. So when you look at Articles, you want to look at this here, because this is actually your proof of your validation. So it proved that this is the 4 factors you're looking at. Okay. Okay, I talked about the factor loadings already. So, and the cutoff I use is above 0.4. There is different authors use different cutoffs. You can use a 0.6 also if you are more strict about it. I see the time is running out, so I just want to push a little bit. Okay, is there any questions on construct validity?
I see there's quite a few questions.
Okay, yes.
So the first one we have is from Toriro. If I use a model like TAM that was validated and found to be reliable, do I still need to do test validity and reliability in my research?
Okay. If you have an already validated model with an already validated scale, you must rather use that. You don't do the validation yourself, because then there's no risk involved. But say, for example, this model was coming from Europe. It was not tested ever in Africa. And you want to test it in Africa, then you can go that route. And what's very important is you look for a validated questionnaire first, and then you just report in your research methodology chapter where it was validated, and you refer to that articles. So that's definitely always your first choice. Okay. And then just one other thing, say you want to do a contribution, it's your PhD, and you want to bring in one other factor that was not existing previously, then you need to use the already validated one and test this new factor together in a new factor analysis. Yes. Okay.
Right, next question. Can I still do pilot questionnaire even if the data questionnaire is validated and reliable?
Yeah, in a sense it's not necessary, but what you can do with the pilot is just test the reliability in your own population. What you need to do is, whatever it is, even if it's validated in your new study, you must test the reliability anyway and report it.
Next question from Ruan. When using a cross-sectional survey design at 2 different points in time, would it be possible to infer causation based on the 2 cross-sectional survey differences if an intervention has been applied to the group of people who participate in the 2 cross-sectional surveys? Yeah.
Okay, you see the problem with that is the causation in an experiment, you need to be able to link the respondents from the one study to the other study. If you're not able to do that, then you will not be able to prove causation. So statistically, you need to link the person filling it in the first time and the second time, because you need to analyze that variation inside the person. Okay.
All right, next question from Zangani. Does each question, example 1.1, or the section 1.2, present a scale, or does each dimension represent its own scale?
Okay, now that's good. Okay, there's a lot of confusion going on here, but usually a scale is consisting of dimensions or constructs. And then so sometimes they can say it's a scale. Say, for example, you have a stress scale, and there's 5 dimensions of stress that you test. And then it's a stress scale, but there's 5 dimensions in it. And then they say, but they have a shortened version of stress. You just test stress in general. Then it's a simple scale of, say, 5 Likert scale questions. Then you can consider it as a scale also. But what we want to say is, there's a scale with a lot of dimensions, and we test it with another scale with a lot of dimensions. But you can have a scale with only 1 dimension also. I'm not sure if that answered the question.
All right, and I think
yes, I see the technology acceptance scale. used for validation of a framework on qualitative research. Okay, I just want to come in there with the framework. I work a lot with people that use frameworks. So in a statistical sense, if you want to present a framework, then you need to do some sort of a model. I see there's something about EFA and PCA.
Are there different flavors of EFA, such as PCA on SPSS? And is there anything we need to consider to choose the most appropriate one?
Okay, in SPSS, okay, again, there's a lot of different views on this, because they use the PCA method, principal components analysis, with Verimax a lot previously. But for validation, a proper exploratory factor analysis is called principal axis factoring. So in SPSS, use the principal axis factoring method. That's advised with exploratory factor analysis. But in SPSS, you can also choose PCA. But I would say for proper exploratory factor analysis, use the principal axis factoring method. Okay.
Perfect. Last question. When carrying out your CFA for model fit, yes, you discover 3 out of 5 model fit indexes are confirming to the threshold values and yes, falling within the range. Do you discard the model on the unit fit, unfit, or do you discard the unfit indexes?
Okay. Okay. Or do you? Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. I didn't talk about confirmatory factor analysis, CFA. Exploratory factor analysis is the first step in validation. Confirmatory factor analysis, second step in validation, because that's for confirming your EFA actually. And that's done in a second study. Now, this is actually difficult to decide, because if 3 of the 5 model fit indexes are confirming and only 2 is out, what you need to do is you need to look at the 2 indexes that's out and why is it. There's different aspects they're looking at for the different fit values. So you can look at what aspect it's out, and then you must make your decision on that. That's a bit of a gray area. That's really a gray area. You cannot, it's not clear cut. Okay.
I also see here from Amy, how does one calculate an eigenvalue?
Okay, that's a mathematical question. Yeah, that's on your matrices when you do matrix manipulation. But what happens is when you do your exploratory factor analysis in SPSS, you'll get the eigenvalues, you'll get that cumulative percentage of variance, all of that. Okay, then ensure validity and reliability. To ensure validity and reliability, we'll look at next very quickly, because the time is really running out, just to choose a validated scale, and then I just want to look at a consistency matrix for 2 minutes. Is that fine? Otherwise, we're running out of time.
I think we can continue. It's fine. If you do feel that you need to go, please remember that we are going to send you the webinar. So if you should leave because of time constraints, you're more than welcome to. Okay.
Okay. Okay. The next thing I just want to show you now. So I showed you now how we do exploratory factor analysis when you do it on your own. And you can only do that when you get back your data. So, and you need enough data to get back enough data to do this. Now, the best would be to rather get a validated scale, to choose a validated scale when you're busy with your literature study from the beginning, then you don't have any problems. Even if you want to make a contribution, like in this case, you want to bring in skill, you start off with a validated scale of the 3 constructs and you bring in 1 more. Okay, so what you look at is when you do your literature study, you look at the matrix of factor loadings, and that's your proof of the validation. Now, this article here is an example of validation that was done. Sorry, I must just go out now. Let me see. Hopefully, I can. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I must go out again. I don't know why the system is doing this. So I just go out quickly to share this again. Okay, can you see the article?
Yes, article validation of factors, Malaysia.
Okay. Okay, this is just to show you when you do your literature study and you look for a validated scale that you don't have all these problems. This is an example of it. Exploratory factor analysis of latent constructs. So this is the constructs or themes or factors we were talking about. And that's for used for measuring public sector innovation performance. So they looked at public sector innovation performance. Okay, now what you're looking for, they actually had a lot of scales in here. So if you look at this, let me just scroll down a little bit. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 different scales they validated. Now what you're looking for is you're looking for, it must say in the methodology, EFA. Now they call this the pilot study, but pilot in this sense is a proper study with, I'm not sure how many people it was, but say 200 or 300. So it's not a pilot in the sense of 10 or 20 people. Now, and you can see in this case, the PCA was used. That was in one of the questions. And there's the criteria I talked about, or some of it. There's the factor loadings I talked about. Okay, now let me just go down just to show you. Here they say, for example, innovation capabilities. This is the scale you're looking at. And then what they say is here, they did principal component analysis for the innovation capabilities construct, extracted 5 components, well, this is dimensions or factors, with eigenvalues exceeding 1. And then it got to 78% of the variance. So you can just report this here, just this sentence here. In your research methodology, refer to this article, and then you can use this innovation capabilities. But what's very important, you need to look at the factor loadings. So when we go to the factor loadings, there is the rotated factor loadings for innovation capabilities. And you see there's the 29 Likert scale questions, the 29. And there's the factor loadings we talked about. So if you look at the first question here, it didn't load anywhere. The second question loaded on component 1 with 0.85. And the third question. So you can see these questions here loaded onto the first component, and then this one's on the second component, and so on. So then what they did is they put it all together. So this leadership here was this questions here, these ones here. And when you read through it, you'll see it's all about leadership. Our top level management provides facilitation, our higher level management accepts trial and error. So you read through these questions and you come up with a common name, which is leadership. And this refers to these questions here. So what you do is when you want to use this, you use only the ones that loaded, these ones that loaded. You can use this here to test leadership. And then you use these ones here to test the next one, which is people management. So all these questions is the ones that loaded. You can see there's only 2 here. The minimum is actually 3 for a construct, the bare minimum. So what you're looking for in the articles is an article like this. And this rotated component matrix, this is your proof. And you must use these questions as it is. Okay, that's very important. And then what they did is they did the Cronbach alpha and test the liability for each of these. Okay, let me just go back. Okay, can you see on the screen?
Yes, we see the slides.
Okay. Okay, I just want to very quickly look at the liability and then the consistency matrix, then we will be finished. Is that fine, Monique?
Yes.
Okay, reliability very quickly. The reliability is testing these constructs now, actually testing the questions of these constructs to see if it's reliable in testing the construct. So we use the internal consistency measure, which is called the Cronbach alpha coefficient. So that's a measure of internal consistency. So it tells us, is it consistently measuring the same thing? So each of the constructs in the scale will be tested. Say, for example, we look at skills, attitude, each of the four we'll test. But this constructs here we're talking about will come from these constructs, will come from the validation. Okay. And then after this is done, we will calculate scores for each of the constructs. So the score will give us a variable now to use in the analysis going forward. Okay. So if you look at the Cronbach alpha, this is just one criteria that's used. There's other criteria they use. Now, the Cronbach alpha coefficient, if it's above 0.8, it's considered good reliability, above 0.6 acceptable reliability, and then below 0.6 unacceptable reliability. So if you do the Cronbach alpha, calculate it, and it's unacceptable, you stopped. You cannot go further. You cannot do any analysis on it. So say, for example, skills comes out as unacceptable with the reliability, you're stuck and you cannot test your hypothesis then. So it's important to maybe test the Cronbach alpha when you do a pilot of say 20 to 30 people. Then you can already know what will the reliability be. Okay, let us look at the next one. Okay, if you look at the Cronbach alpha for the constructs that we're looking at here, so we got skills, we got perceived ease of use, we got perceived usefulness here, and we got attitude. Now skills was the new one. Now the Cronbach alpha is 0.79, 0.83, 0.9, 0.8, so it's all way above 0.6. So there's no problem. So we can calculate scores for each of these four constructs here in order to go back to our model now. So we don't have any problems at this stage. Now they sometimes report the overall Cronbach alpha. That's not the average of this, it's the overall Cronbach alpha of everything, of the whole scale. Now, okay, that's the reliability. Now the next step would be to calculate scores for each of this constructs. So we want to have a composite score. So it would be, usually it's the average of the reliable items of the construct. So say, for example, when you do the Cronbach alpha and there's one of the items that's unreliable and you take it out, then you will not use it in the score here. So that's why I say when you do your own scale, 4 to 6 questions per construct, because if you lose one, you still have 3 left. Okay. Then let us look at the skills one. There's 3 questions here. So this 3 questions divided by 3 will give us the score for skills. And we do it for the other 3 constructs also. Okay, let us just look at the skill score for the first respondent. So say, for example, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the Likert scale. I am feeling I have the skill to use this system. So I agreed with the 4 here. I strongly agreed. And I take the average, so I come to a score of 4.67, which is there. So this score, this skill score is calculated for each person, and this is now used in your analysis. And it's very important because this is used in testing your hypotheses. So that's why we want to make sure it's valid, the skill score, it's reliable, and we can calculate it. That's very important. Otherwise, we're stuck. We cannot do test our hypothesis. Okay, is there any questions?
No.
Okay, I'll just do the consistency matrix now, looking at the analysis. That would be 5 minutes, then we stop. Okay, you fine? All fine with that?
Perfect.
Okay. Okay, just to look at the statistical technique. So you'll use statistical techniques to test these hypotheses we looked at in the beginning. So if you want to look at the influence of some variables on something else, so we want to say the influence of ease of use and usefulness on attitude, you can use a multiple linear regression. That's the statistical technique. So you just need to know you have your hypothesis, you have your questionnaire, it's valid and reliable, you have a statistical technique to test it. Great. Then another technique that's used to test the whole model would be the structural equation modeling. So they use structural equation modeling. You can put everything into the structural equation model to test it. Okay. Then the structure equation model, you have a measuring part. So it's this part here. So this is the full constructs, and there's all the questions relating to each of the constructs. And then you have a structural part, and this is where you actually test your hypothesis. So you set up your hypothesis here, and we want to see if skills influence ease of use. We want to see if ease of use influence usefulness. We want to see if usefulness and ease of use influence attitude, these two. And then there's all the hypotheses we test. And that's our model we want to propose. So if you look at hypotheses, now just to get back to this, so just remember, these must all be valid and reliable constructs that's coming from the questionnaire in order to do this model here. Okay. Now to develop the hypothesis here or write it out, the first hypothesis, this is just now the research hypothesis, or that's the alternative hypothesis. Skills have a statistically significant influence on ease of use. Then ease of use have a statistically significant influence of usefulness. And then ease of use have a statistically significant influence on attitude. And then usefulness have a statistically significant influence on attitude. And there's the full model that we look at. Okay, so we will look now through the whole process, and we back to the analysis that we want to do. Okay, I will not do questions now. I just want to show you the consistency matrix. The consistency matrix I use is to make sure everything in your research is aligned. So please use this matrix before you send out your questionnaire. So let us look at this matrix here. First, you can use this for qualitative also. So first you have your literature and your theory. So this will be driving everything. Everything comes from your theory. And you have your articles here. Then you have your research question, hypothesis, objectives, and you state each one in a line. So say, for example, there's a simple research question: investigate the influence of usefulness and ease of use on attitude. And you'll present all your research questions here. Now, if you look at this research question, what is the things that we measure here? You look at usefulness, we look at ease of use, and we look at attitude. And then usefulness, you must state in your questionnaire, where is usefulness? It's these 5 Likert scale questions. Ease of use is these questions. Attitude is these questions. And then this constructs here must be valid and reliable. If it is, you refer to the articles where you got it. If not, you do an EFA. Then these constructs here forms a variable. So this is all construct scores that will be continuous, and it will allow multiple linear regression. And you must say, is the sample size large enough to do the multiple regression and even to do the EFA if that's needed. And there's another example. Okay. You're fine with that? Is there any questions on that?
There's one question.
Yes.
Is there a similar matrix to use if you are developing your own scale as part of the research?
Okay, so the scale is actually your contribution. The scale is the contribution, I presume.
It's correct.
If the scale is the contribution, then the analysis would then, to answer that research question, would be the EFA. So yes, then this will fall away. Because this will fall away because this is actually your contribution, so that will become the analysis. Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, then let me just show you, yeah, if you want to contact me, there's online courses. There is an online course on what I did just now, and there's a 40% discount for this course. So everything I presented now is in a full course. A full course. Okay. Is there any questions that I must still answer?
While we wait for questions, I'm going to set up my presentation so long.
Okay. Sorry, Monique, for taking a bit more time. Okay, is there any questions, skills? Are skills done for each question or the whole document? The skill scores will then consist of the 4 Likert scale questions. Okay, Monique, you will cut me off, then I'll just answer the chat in the chat.
Yes.
And then you must just make me available when I will ask the questions.
Perfect.
Okay.
I'm not going to mute you now. Okay, let me just share my video. All right, so welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the qualitative part of this webinar. My name is Monique, if you have missed it in the beginning, and I am here to discuss the qualitative part of this webinar. So I have thought that instead of asking questions, I'm going to leave questions up until the end of my slideshow. So if you do have questions, note them down somewhere so that in the end, we would be able to address these questions. Perfect. Henny, can you see my slide?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Okay. So with regards to qualitative research, there are many definitions for qualitative research. So I have chosen these two as part of the definition. So qualitative research is an interpretive, naturalistic approach to the world. Qualitative research study the things in their natural setting in order to attempt to make sense of or interpret this phenomena in terms of the meanings that people bring to them. So it is a strategy for the systemic collection, organization, and interpretation of textual information in order to generate an understanding. And when I say textual information, it is usually based on, for instance, interview transcripts that has been transcribed to text. So the characteristics of qualitative research is basically, or the purpose is basically to understand the meaning. And the researcher is the research instrument with regards to qualitative research. So too often we hear, it is not personal, but qualitative research is personal. You are the instrument in this research process. You are part of the process, and who you are and the way you view things is inherent in your analysis, as well as the interpretation and the writing. So it is human to feel that every comment and review speaks to your personal abilities, skill, and standing, or that the amount of data are too daunting, or that you have failed. It is normal to feel that. So qualitative usually involves field work, conducting interviews, or focus groups, just to name some. So with regards to the qualitative process, you are working towards an end product, and this end product is being able to code. So there are a few things that you would need to consider, and these are some of the things. So for instance, the first thing that you would need to consider is, what is your design? Obviously, if you are using a quantitative design, you will not be coding qualitatively. The next thing that you need to identify is your paradigmatic perspective. So a paradigm is a set of beliefs that tend to define the nature of inquiry for researchers. So paradigms define the belief systems that attach users to a certain worldview. So usually paradigms cannot be mixed, but it can. It can only be mixed when you are using a mixed method design. So if you are using a mixed method design, you would make use of pragmatism as a paradigmatic perspective. However, if you are using a qualitative paradigmatic perspective, you would make use of, for instance, interpretivism, constructionism, and relativism. So interpretivism is one of the most common ones used in qualitative research. So with regards to the paradigm, we also need to consider the research question. Research question is one of the most important things that you need to identify, because at the end, as you analyze this data qualitatively, you would need to identify, for instance, what am I working towards? What is the thing, or what is the phenomena that I need to answer? And you would be able to answer that through your research question. And to make things a bit more easier for you, you would be able to identify this through your aims and objectives. Identify your research question and break it up into few aims and objectives in order to identify or in order to answer that research question. Moving on, you also need your contextual theory, which I kind of find most of the time lacking with dissertations. So with regards to your contextual theory, you would need to identify a certain type of theory in order to support the type of analysis that you are conducting. So for instance, just an example based on my dissertation, I had investigated whether guide dogs has an impact on people's well-being. And I've identified a contextual theory named PERMA. So PERMA is a contextual theory that defines well-being. So I would have been able to identify what factors of well-being I am looking at by identifying the contextual theory known as PERMA. So that is also another thing that you need to consider. And lastly, your analytical and methodological approach. You would need to identify what is the sample that you need for this study. And you would need to identify what analytical theory am I going to use. So with regards to analytical theories, there are many analytical theories in qualitative research. However, for the purpose of this presentation, we are going to follow a thematic analysis. And the reason why I've chosen thematic analysis is that most qualitative data analysis are based on the same fundamental principle of identifying common themes and patterns. If we think about interpretive phenomenological analysis, the main goal is to identify code and themes. Grounded theory, all of these analytical theories has the same fundamental processes of creating codes and identifying themes. So these are the things that you would need to identify in order to answer your research question at the end and be able to code. So with regards to qualitative coding employs an inductive reasoning, which means that it is an iterative nature approach. So basically, while you are busy conducting the literature for your research, you are looking at things such as your research question, and afterwards you would start gathering your data. You would then start gathering, or you would start analyzing your first few transcripts, and therefore you would be able to identify, for instance, any gaps that's missing in your research. So that's why I say it's iterative in nature. It's a process that you constantly would go back and forth in order to gain as much data and information as possible, and at the end answer your research question. So with regards to data collection and qualitative research, there are three ways of collecting qualitative data. For instance, listening to informants, observations, and examining materials. And there are different ways and methods that we can gather this information. The most common one that I've identified with regards to my clients is interviews. However, you can also, for instance, conduct focus groups, observations, artifacts, documents, and for instance, we have more alternative ways lately, such as analyzing blog posts, webinars, and so forth. So with regards to data collection, I've identified interview development as one of the most important factors related to qualitative research. You would need to identify what is your research question, what is the purpose of the study, and then at the end, develop questions to answer this research question. So you would need to think about things such as, what are the main priorities in my data? What questions will help me to answer the research question? And how should I order the topics? And the best way for you to answer these questions that I've just posed is, for instance, to either consult your peer or supervisor. Make sure that you consult someone in order to identify if what you are saying, for instance, if you identified your interview framework, if it is relatable to your research question. Give it to someone else, for instance, just to read through, and that person would be able to say, for instance, can or are you answering the research question? While you are developing an interview framework, you would also need to think about the paradigm and, for instance, probing. So probing is used in order to give a non-directive question to someone. Because at the end, when you conduct an interview, you would want to avoid directing your participant in a certain way. And when I say direct, I mean, for instance, you do not want to ask a question, for instance, such as, how has the COVID impacted you? For instance, that would be a great non-directive question. But if the person has answered this and you found that this person has not answered it the way you wanted, it is not encouraged to ask this person, for instance, would you feel that you are more stressed? Because that is a way of directing them. Because the person would then answer, oh yes, definitely. I have considered stress as a major impact. So definitely try to avoid non-directive question. Another thing that you need to do is encourage your participants to tell you more. I always send my interview framework, and before I even meet my participants, I send my interview framework to them. And the reason why I do this is for the person to familiarize themselves with the research question and the research basis. And in the end, when we actually physically have this interview, I would encourage the participant. So instead of directing the participant with a question such as, do you feel more anxious? I would have asked the participants, for instance, can you tell me more about your feelings towards the COVID? So those are ways that you, in the end, can actually get the data that is needed. You can also make use of, for instance, making use of and for instance, while the person is talking to you. Making use of cues such as acknowledgement by making use of and ahs, you would be able to invite the participants to explore more about what they are talking about. And in the end, if this does not work as well, you can start with things with gentle queries such as, I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Can you please tell me more about your feelings during the COVID lockdown? And also requesting clarification. Sometimes a participant can feel so overwhelmed and stressed in the interview that it might even feel that they're not talking sense. It is no problem at all to ask this participant, please help me understand and please clarify this. And these are ways that you would conduct an interview successfully. In order to identify an interview guide, you would need to identify a few things. So the things that I have identified is opening questions, introductory questions, key questions, closing questions, and final questions. So opening questions would be a general question. It's there to release the tension. Usually what I would do is I would give an overview, an introduction of what this research is about. And then just, for instance, asking an introductory question about your main topic. You can then reflect on experiences and participants' connection to the overall topic. There afterwards, you would need to identify 2 to 5 key questions. These key questions are usually the core of the discussion. It is the most important part of the analysis. These key questions are there in order for you to answer your research question. And in the end, you would also need closing questions. Closing questions would comprise of reflection, reflecting what the participant has said in order for them to confirm. Or, for instance, providing a summary of what the participant has said. And lastly, ending off with, is there anything else you would like to mention? So many times I have realized that even though you have these 5 or 6 set out questions, that participants have a different opinion perhaps. And if you ask them, is there anything else, they might add to the value of the study. Because remember, as you are analyzing your interview questions, you can rephrase or not rephrase, you can develop your interview framework or redevelop your interview framework in order to address all the things. Perfect. So now what we are going to discuss is the trustworthiness of a study. So the trustworthiness relates a lot to validity and reliability in quantitative measures. However, levels of trustworthiness has been identified as the qualitative way. So Lincoln and Gruber has identified levels of trustworthiness, and they wanted to see how truthfully the value is within your data analysis and interpretation. And you would be able to identify these things as you go on through the process. So the first thing that I would like to mention is credibility. So credibility is, for instance, related to internal validity. This is where you get a lot of info from different authors and from different literatures in order to address the confidence in the truth of the data and the interpretations, making the study more credible by identifying what different authors has mentioned in this study. Then we can go on to dependability. So dependability is the stability of data over time and over conditions. So for instance, this would relate to the reliability if we had to mention quantitative studies. So dependability is where you would start reading and making use of different not just authors, but for instance, consulting your supervisor in order to make sure that the information that you have gathered is dependable, that it is stable. And for instance, that you are not using your own ideas. Because in the end, if we think about qualitative research, we want to convey the message of the participant, not the message of our own ideas. So by making use of dependability, by consulting different authors and, for instance, consulting your supervisor, you would be able to see if I am conveying my ideas or if I am conveying the ideas of the participant. The next thing that we can discuss is confirmability, and this relates to being objective or objectivity. So usually this is when 2 people are in agreement and the literature supports the data. So this is congruence between 2 or more people in order to address the accuracy, the relevance, and meaning of the study. One can identify, or one can become confirmable by making use of co-coders. If you have coded your data, you would have already identified a code book with a list of all the codes you've created. What you can do then is give this code book to another coder. For instance, someone in the field. We also do this as a service from Liminal, where someone else would be able to code this for you. And afterwards, you would sit with this co-coder and you would look at what are the similarities? What have we coded that is similar? And what have we coded in different ways? And you would report on that. And in the end, by being in agreement with another coder, you would then be able to develop a fully analyzed or fully code list. Then we can move on to transferability. This is usually this relates to the generalizability of the study. So it is the extent to which findings can be transferred to other settings or group. So with regards to transferability, it is, for instance, if I am conducting a study based on South African culture, I cannot generalize the findings based on culture in Korea or South or America also, because all of us have different values and we have different ways of approaching things. So therefore, you would be able to address transferability by identifying thick descriptions about the sample and the setting. Thick descriptions usually is defining, for instance, my sample is set out of these participants based on this area, based on this perception. And by defining it, you would also, for instance, relate it back to whatever someone else has already said, what other authors have said. And that makes your study more transferable. So Lincoln and Guba has also identified another factor known as authenticity, which is not mentioned here. This was only added later. But authenticity is usually making use of words or excerpts from the participants, using your participants' words in order to convey their message and not the message of the researcher. So ethics is often discussed in terms of data collection and designing the research. So ethics do, however, play an important role in the analysis as well. The responsibility of the researcher needs to be thoroughly documented and explored. So much of the ethics is embedded in the trustworthiness of the research. And for instance, how you have identified these factors in order to add to the trustworthiness of your own data. So just to quickly give you an idea, in order to establish trustworthiness, we can identify credibility by prolonged engagement in literature, referential adequacy, peer debriefing. Transferability can be identified with thick descriptions. Dependability and confirmability can therefore then be identified by making use of raw data, making use of the participants saying, and also, for instance, making process notes and looking at material that is related to your study. So, thematic analysis is we are going to talk about how thematic analysis is the basis of all qualitative research. For instance, I have identified, or I've already mentioned, that most qualitative data analysis are based on the fundamental principle of identifying common themes or patterns. For instance, the wording just differs. In thematic analysis, we would talk about codes and categories and themes. And for instance, in interpretive phenomenological analysis, we would talk about, I can't remember. I think it's themes, and I cannot remember. But that is just an example to show you that although all of these thematic or all of these analysis techniques follows the process of identifying codes and themes, although it is just the wording is used different in most of these analyses, and that is how they differentiate. They would also differentiate based on, for instance, certain set out objectives and aims that you would need to identify. So with regards to thematic analysis, you would not need to identify all these certain aims, but with regards to, let's say, interpretive phenomenological analysis or grounded analysis, there are certain aims that you would need to follow. So for today, we are going to discuss thematic analysis as it is the basis of all the analysis. So thematic analysis is a method for identifying, analyzing, and reporting patterns, which can be seen as themes within the data. It minimally organizes and describes your data in rich detail. However, frequently it goes further than this and interprets various aspects of the research topic. So we can, for instance, see that thematic analysis is there for you to identify certain patterns. And we can identify these patterns by engaging in a coding process. So any researcher who wishes to become proficient at doing qualitative analysis must learn to code well and code easily. So the excellence of the research rests in large part on the excellence of the coding. It's not about creating themes. Themes are just there to organize your data in certain categories. But in the end, coding is the most important analytical process in qualitative research. So if you guys would like to become the perfect coder, there is a book, The Coding Manual for Qualitative Researchers by Johnny Saldana, and I can definitely recommend this book in order for you to get familiar with the process of coding. So the thematic analysis comprises of 6 phases. The first phase, which is where you should familiarize yourself with the data. I always say, immerse yourself with the data. Read it, reread it, and for the fun of it, read it again. Because that is the only way that you are going to identify certain patterns. And as you are reading, already start noting down things that you see or that you can see is common in the data. After you have read and read and read, and you have transcribed your data if necessary, the next part would be to generate your initial codes. So the phase 2 is the coding interesting features of the data in a systematic fashion across the entire data set, collating data relevant to each other. You would start off by identifying certain codes based on the data extracts. And if I say data extracts, I mean, for instance, your interview quotations. After you have generated initial code, I always bring in an additional step of recoding again. For instance, you have a first cycle of coding where you would start off with the coding process. However, I would suggest engaging in a second cycle of coding. Go through your code list just one more time and go through your interview transcripts just to make sure that you have captured all the essence of what the participants are saying. After you have coded and made use of second level of coding, you would need to search for themes. So searching for themes is where you start collating codes into potential themes, gathering all the data relevant to each potential theme. For instance, here you would identify, I have identified all of these few codes, but somehow, how can I categorize that these codes form a coherent idea, one specific idea? And that categorization is known as themes. And right after step 3, we have step 4, which is reviewing the themes. Checking in the themes work in relation to the coded extracts, which is our interview transcripts, and the entire data set, generating a thematic map of the analysis. So for instance, you would be able to identify a thematic map by looking at how you have identified different codes and how these codes relate to the themes and how these themes relate to one another. And the way that you would be able to do that is by defining your themes. So defining and naming themes in step 5 would be the ongoing analysis to refine the specifics of each theme and the overall story the analysis tells, therefore generating clear definitions and names for each theme. So you can kind of already notice that by defining themes and creating thick descriptions, we are adding to the transferability of the study. And at the end, producing the report. So producing a report is the final opportunity for the analysis. Selection of vivid, compelling extract examples, final analysis of selected extracts relating back to the analysis, to the research question and literature, and then at the end, producing a report. So with regards to producing a report, you would need to identify, for instance, what has other literature and other authors mentioned about these codes and themes that I have identified. So thematic analysis provides the opportunity to develop coding and thematicizing skills, which are the basis for multiple research methodologies. Once these base skills are in place, it needs to be contextualized in a theoretical and philosophical stance. Data do not simply talk for themselves or speak for themselves. You would need to go through the process of identifying what is the story that this data is telling me. So to bring it or to conclude, thematic analysis is in essence a process of breaking a multitude of data, which usually consists of text, although it might be sound and images or videos, into meaningful sections and then recombining them into groups of concepts and ideas which fit together, bringing certain concepts and ideas of the participants together is your aim in this research. So in research language, this is referred to as the coding cycle, which is breaking up the text and naming of each section, and at the end, creating the themes and allocating them into their right groups. I'm going to show you guys a practical example of how to make use of thematic analysis in ATLAS.ti, which is a qualitative data software program that can assist you in organizing your data. There are also other programs such as InVivo and QDA or something. If you would need training, for instance, in ATLAS.ti, you're more than welcome to contact us. We do also have other consultations that can provide training in InVivo and so forth. So just to get back to what is a code. So a code is most often a word or a phrase that symbolically assigns a summative, salient, essence capturing to an evocative attribute for a portion of language-based or visual data. Data can consist of interview transcripts, participants' observation, field notes, journals, and so forth. The portion of the data to be coded during the first cycle coding process can range in magnitude from a single word to a full sentence to an entire page of a text to a stream of moving images. However, in your second cycling processes, the portions are coded to the exact same unit. So this is where first level of first cycle coding processes is where you would kind of roughly identify codes. And your second cycle of coding is where you would redefine and actually look at the coding so that in the end, you'll have a visual representation of, for instance, codes and themes of what the data represents. So first cycle of coding, code roughly. Second cycle of coding is where you would rather rework it and make it more finalized in the coding process. So just as the title represents and captures a book or a film, primary content and essence, so does a code represent and capture a datum's primary content and essence. For instance, if you look at a book's title, you would need to identify, or you would kind of note what the essence is in the title. And that is what you would need to do with coding. You would need to read, what did this participant say? What is the essence of what this participant is saying? And what can I relate it to? And obviously, in the end, you would relate it to something that you kind of already know. By reading the literature, you have gathered the information of what might be relevant. Generating themes codes are usually very specific. They may have over 100 codes. I've had a client which had 1,002 codes, which I thought was way too much. But however, we can see, for instance, that there is no limitation of code saturation. The only way that you would know if you have identified code saturation is by going through the cycles of coding. Because if you go through the first cycle of coding, you would have identified codes, but you would have reworked this framework in the second cycle of coding. We cluster codes together to create meaningful units, to create themes, and sometimes also known as code categories. Themes become the subheadings to the final chapter in your thesis, and it provides the structure of your report. So the codes in each theme gives you a roadmap of all the different aspects you need to cover in the discussion of each theme. So for instance, just to give you an example, on the left-hand side, we have an image of what a theme would look like. So I'm not sure if everybody can read because it seems quite small, but for instance, we can identify that in the domain of experiences of the tsunami, we can see that there were 5 codes attributed. So we can see under the experiences of the tsunami, there were experienced flight for survival, left the house and escaped for a safe place, self or family members injured, search for missing loved ones, and witness traumatic scenes. So you can kind of notice that people has taken, or this author or analyst has taken ideas, and at the end, these ideas were the codes. And these codes were then attributed to a theme, which will then kind of give you a summative explanation of the codes underneath the theme. So with regards to coding, there's also another level of coding. For instance, if you would need to identify categories, that is also a step that you can follow. So with regards to this step is you would first identify codes, whereafter you would attribute these codes to categories. And lastly, you would attribute these categories into a theme. This is usually used with big data sets. If you have a small data set, it is not necessarily, it's not necessary for you, for instance, to make use of a category by just combining codes and themes. But if you have big data sets, it might make more sense if you add an extra level of coding by identifying the categories. So that is the end of the slideshow. I just want to show everybody quickly how you would go about with regards to making use of coding in
Monique?
ATLAS.ti. Yes.
Sorry, there's a few questions. Can I?
Okay, cool. Let's do questions first.
Or do you want to do this first?
Let me quickly show everyone and then we can do the questions.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to open my ATLAS.ti. Henny, if you can just confirm if it is shown on the screen.
Yes, I see ATLAS.ti.
Okay, perfect. You would then start off by creating a new project and naming it towards, for instance, your title. So just give it a few seconds to load. So this is the platform of what ATLAS.ti looks like. It is very important that all of you take note that ATLAS.ti is not going to do the analysis automatically for you. Nope. ATLAS.ti is more of a management tool in order for you to manage large sets of data. For instance, if you have identified a code in the first level of coding, you would be able to edit this code according to its quotations based on ATLAS.ti, which makes it a lot easier, for instance, to manage all this data. So the first thing that you would need to do in ATLAS.ti is add the document. So I'm just going to add one document. You can add more than one document, for instance, if you have more than one interview. Let's go to the desktop. So we can see on the left-hand side that we have added our documents, and we can kind of notice that this is the interview. The first thing that you would need to do, for instance, is read and reread and read if you follow the thematic analysis steps from Braun and Clarke. The next step would then be to start with the coding process. So I'm just going to zoom a bit in. For instance, we can see that this study is about the blue economy and how, or the ocean blue economy, and how people have looked at the blue ocean economy and how people have made use of this in order to, at the end, make this economy more sustainable. So that was the aim of the research. I'm not going to, for instance, code this first part of the interview because this is just more of an introduction. It's just basically telling the participant what this research is about and so forth. So we can go, for instance, in this little area where the respondent says, all right, sure. So I think in our minds really, or in my mind, it's about the ocean by sustainable development. But it's, I think, very important to consider the needs of a healthy environment. So already I can identify a code. So you would code this by selecting your data, which is not selectable today. So you would be able to code this by selecting your data, and people always ask me, how do I know what to select? And it's all based on your perception of what this participant is saying. What is the importance or the essence conveyed by reading what this participant is saying? So for instance, we would be able to code this first part by selecting the data and then at the top clicking on open coding. So open coding is, for instance, whenever you start off creating a code, you would open or create a code freely based on the data. So I would just press, for instance, at the top here on open coding, and we can then attribute a code. So my code would then be to look at the needs of a healthy environment. And I would create it. So we can see on the left-hand side that I've created this code, and you would be able, for instance, by clicking on the code, by expanding the selection or not. Whenever I create a code, I then go over to defining the code. Because if we remember that part of the process of establishing trustworthiness is thick descriptions. So you would do this by, for instance, right-clicking on the code and selecting Edit Comment. And we can see, for instance, code needs of unhealthy environments can now then be defined. So the definition is about how this code is related. Your definition can, for instance, also also add to the definition literature that supports this code. And if you feel your definition is fine, you can close it and it will save it. As you go through the process of creating codes and defining, you would also realize that your definition will change. You might, in the first level of coding, have identified a certain code, but as you go through the process and you read what the participants have said, you can realize that this definition needs a little bit change, and therefore adapt your definition. So that in the end, you'll have a full defined code of how this code relates to the research and what literature have I identified to support this claim. You can also, to make it a bit more interesting, identify common things. So for instance, I can say that although I have identified needs of a healthy environment as a code, I can also, for instance, read what other participants have said. And I can add to this code. So with regards to the first level of coding, you would code openly, read all of the information, and as you go through, code what you feel is important. There is no rule about selecting a code or the quote based on a paragraph. There's no rule about selecting a quote based on a certain sentence. It's all about your perception of how does this relate to the research question. Because in the end, you need to consider, remember in the beginning, I had the spider diagram. So you would need to consider, what is my research question? Not just open codes without thinking about your research question. And creating codes to think about what analytic framework am I using. This is a thematic analysis, so I would need to keep certain objectives in mind. For instance, defining it correctly. And as you go on to the second level, you can then redefine, maybe combine codes together. Or for instance, you might identify in the second level code process that you have coded one code with a frequency or amount of way more than the rest. And that would kind of give you an indication of how many times that code was used. And should I then split it up, for instance? So you can kind of make use of this process in order then at the end to rework your analysis to follow a certain report. So I'm just going to create a few more codes just to give you an example of what a coding would look like. So I'm just going to name it code 1. It's also important to remember that you should try and stick to coding only your respondent and not coding the interviewer. Okay, so we can kind of notice by looking at this left-hand panel that codes have been I have created 3 codes. And if we expand the document section, we can also, for instance, see in the bracket that this specific document has been coded 3 times. The reason why I'm showing this to you, if you have another interview transcript and another interview transcript, in the end, you would need to see, okay, document has been coded 30 times. Document 2 has been coded 10 times, and document 3 has been coded, let's say, 35 times. That would mean that you would need to go back to document 2 and reread. Because if you think about it, if all the documents had a high coded frequency, you would need to have all the documents kind of related to that frequency. So if a document has been coded very low, go back to that document and recode it again. So after you have completely read through this transcript, you have coded it once, you have read it again, and you've coded it twice, and you are kind of happy with your codes, you would then start with the thematic process or creating themes. So When creating themes in ATLAS.ti, you would need to open your code manager. So I'm just going to open my code manager via home, clicking on the code manager right there. And we can kind of identify all the codes that we've created. Groundedness will change as you create more codes. Groundedness is based on the amount of times this code was used. So obviously, let me just go back, code another code. And I can do this by making use of list coding. List coding refers to the codes that you've already created and you want to make use of them again. So let's say, for instance, I use code 3 again. Going back to my code manager, we can now notice that code 3 has increased in frequency. And this is how you would create a code list. In the end, if you are done with your code list, you start creating themes. You can do this by categorizing things that are similar and allocating them to a theme. So if you can look in right next to my codes, there is a little space open for code groups. Code groups in ATLAS.ti refers to themes. So for instance, if I just drag these two codes that I've selected and drop it in that open space, I am now able to create my theme. So this is the process that you would need to follow in ATLAS.ti. Just remember that ATLAS.ti is a free software. However, it only limits you to 100 quotations and 10 documents. Some universities do provide a license key to a full license subscription to ATLAS.ti. Thus, if your university does provide this license, I would highly recommend getting it and then playing around with ATLAS.ti in order to code your data. There's also a lot of YouTube videos to assist you with this coding process. And we have also developed a manual in order to assist with a step-by-step guide with regards to analyzing in ATLAS.ti. So that is the basic process of conducting thematic analysis in ATLAS.ti. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I hope that the process of analyzing in ATLAS.ti did assist you. I am, however, going to go to the questions now and answer the questions.
Monique, I've made a list.
Oh, okay, cool.
But you can go through also. If you miss something, I can just maybe point it out.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out where the first question is.
Can I just go up? This one from, do you see the one from Moment? Some scholars state a particular number of study participants to saturate, yet others would argue against. Comment on this in relation to sample size in a qualitative study. Do you see that one? That was the first question I picked up.
I'm just trying to quickly get it. The skills, minis.
It's Moment.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Moment.
There's a in brackets.
I see it's from Grant.
Yes. Okay, that's the first one. That's the first one from Grant.
So if I'm doing a qualitative study, but I want to say what percentage of my interviewees were male and female, percentage number.
Yes.
Is the study still completely qualitative? So it is still regarded as a qualitative research. The reason for that is that you still need to describe, for instance, your sample. You still need to identify, for instance, what were the ages amongst your participants. So it won't transfer to a quantitative study if you only look at the percentages of, for instance, males and females. So how do you use hybrid analysis, namely inductive and deductive? So with regards to inductive and deductive, thematic analysis would follow more of an inductive process whereby you don't really have theory that follows the research process. It's rather that you would freely identify and focus on what the participant is saying. However, with deductive, which is more of a grounded process, you would first identify a theory. And after you've identified the theory, you would then look at a code list that you've already created, and then only you would go to the interview transcripts. So it's all about, for instance, a bottom-up and a top-down approach. The one you would start by identifying the interviews and going through what the participants have said, and then just considering the thematic process and the theory. However, the other one is where you already have a theory and you want to test that specific theory. So that's differences between inductive and deductive. With regards to deductive and making use of a grounded study, one can also look at co-coder agreement and the co-coder reliability. So this is to see what agreements were significant based on the two different coders. So some scholars state a particular number of study participants to saturate 7 to 17, yet others would argue against. Comment on this in relation to sample size in a qualitative study. With regards to a qualitative study, you would even see based on the thematic analysis that there are a lot of arguments based on what you should follow or not. And it's quite difficult and overwhelming to at the end identify which process you are going to follow. But for instance, if you can support whatever process you have followed with the correct theory, then that would be fine. However, based on my experiences, qualitative usually compromises of participants from 8 till 10 or more. So minimum 8 or more. In the end, qualitative is not about getting the participants, but getting the information from the participants. So if we follow the iterative process, for instance, collecting your data interviews, then after going and analyzing and coding these documents and to see, have I gained the correct information? And going back to the interviews then and adapting what you have done now towards this process. That will also assist you then, for instance, identifying data saturation. So there isn't really a way of saying you need to get this amount of participants. It is based on, for instance, are you answering your research question? Are you answering your aims and objectives? And if you are going towards the correct process. But if you have collected 30 participants and none of these interviews answer any research question, aim, or objectives, you still need to go and redo the interviews then. So that's the important thing. Some scholars state a particular, no, sorry, that's the one I already did. Is probing technique in interviews similar to social engineering? I have no idea what social engineering is. So unfortunately, I cannot answer that question. So is it allowed to use quiz in qualitative approach? It depends on what type of quiz. If your quiz is based on close-ended questions, no. But if you have a quiz, for instance, that looks at the experiences and perceptions of people, yes. So it all depends on what the data is telling you. Are there other frameworks other than Lincoln and Guba that explain trustworthiness? Yes, there is. I'm not familiar at the top of my head, but I'm sure if you are interested, you can email me and I can provide you with these resources. So thematic analysis, or Milton has asked, how is thematic analysis different from grounded theory? So Thematic analysis is the basis of all analytical frameworks. For instance, all of these frameworks would identify creating codes and categorizing them in, for instance, categorizations or themes. In the end, the difference is the process that you need to follow. If you read up on grounded theory, there are certain aims and objectives that needs to be stated clearly for you to follow. With thematic analysis, you do not have these certain theoretical aims and objectives to follow. But with grounded theory, there are certain steps and a certain type of language that you would also need to follow. So it's all about how you convey these results in the end. When I do provide you with the slides, you would see the reference of the book. Does thematic analysis work for all qualitative studies? Are there exceptions where you simply cannot use thematic analysis in qualitative study? Based on my experience, thematic analysis is mostly used in qualitative research. However, I am not familiar with any exceptions. So the exceptions would only be based upon, for instance, what your aims and your objectives is, and if it follows a thematic process. So you need to identify, for instance, would it be better if I do a grounded approach? Would it be better if I do a thematic analysis? Or would it be better if I do a content analysis? So it all depends on your framework and what you have identified. So based on the recommendation between ATLAS.ti and NVivo, based on my experience, I find ATLAS.ti more easily to work with. However, both of them are very good programs to use. I cannot really give you major differences. I can, for instance, tell you that NVivo has an extra coding level where you can add categories. However, most of the processes of these two programs are followed in quite similar manner. Can one integrate theories as part of the theoretical conceptual framework in a dissertation? For example, use 2 or 3 theories. Is it advisable or does it complicate the study? With regards to qualitative, if I can comment on the qualitative part, is you can definitely use more than one theory. It all depends at the end how you bring this theory in, how you relate your analysis at the end and bring it back towards your theory. So you kind of need to have a link between those two as you go through the analysis. So, Amy, this thematic analysis appears similar to the construction of an ethnogram in animal behavior. So in social sciences, once you've constructed your code, do you run any quantitative analysis such as frequency of occurrence among your interview participants for each theme that you coded? Behavior, we look at frequency of occurrence and duration of occurrence of behaviors. I'm just wondering how one transfers any of this qualitative code into quantitative analysis. So just for interest's sake, is if you are going to focus on the frequencies of codes, you are going into more of a content analysis, where content analysis is you have identified codes, you have defined these codes, and in the end, apologies. So in the end, you would then look at the frequencies of the codes. And for instance, if one of the codes were used way less than the other codes, you would be able to report on that as well. So with regards to thematic analysis is not really the focus of how many times a code has been used. But obviously, it is important when you rework your codes. For instance, if you have a code list and one of the codes has been used twice and all the other codes has been used 30 times or more, you can either then rework the code by looking at, for instance, combining it with another code, or for instance, just deleting it. It all depends on your aim. So I hope I've answered that question. Someone has asked if I can show them a heavily coded document. Ethically, unfortunately, I'm not allowed. The reason behind this is that the data of all the individuals are not allowed to be seen by other people, for instance. So unfortunately, I cannot show you a coded document from my side. However, if you do Google, for instance, a coded document in ATLAS.ti, a fully coded document in ATLAS.ti, it will show you an example as well. So thank you so much for your presentation. However, I felt left out because no aspect of analysis for natural science were addressed. Is it possible then to host another workshop to address your presentation to cover the natural sciences, because my research is experimental and I did not see how I would use what was presented during my study. So just to get back to you about that, is you are more than welcome, for instance, if we did not cover any information today based on your research, to set up a meeting with us or a Zoom meeting, and we would be able to discuss these aspects. Yes, Amy?
There's somebody that asked for transcribing software recommended for students.
So there are a few transcribing software for students. There is Neuroscience Dragon, and if you email me, I'll give you another one as well, which my students have used. However, in the end, if you do transcribe or make use of a transcribing software, it's still very important to double check all the data, for instance, if you have transcribed it correctly. You can also contact us. We have a fully equipped team to do transcribing for you, and we have a short, what is the word? For instance, if you, so we have a short time, for instance, if you do contact us for transcribing, you would be able to get your transcripts back within a week.
There's somebody that asked, what is a systematic method for calculating sample size in qualitative research?
So unfortunately, I'm not familiar or that much familiar with a systemic approach. However, there should be different information on how many articles you should combine. What I have gathered from different clients is that you should select, for instance, a time frame based on, for instance, January 2010 up until January 2022, and you would gather all these articles in a time frame, and you would be able to systemically review them. So you would be able to review them quantitatively or qualitatively. It all depends on the approach that you've taken.
Then somebody wanted you to talk a little bit about the IPA method or approach.
So if you would like to read up about the IPA approach, I would then suggest reading up more about Smith. Is it Smith? I think it's Smith. So Smith has explained this very well in one of his published handbooks, textbooks. And unfortunately, I do not think we have enough time to discuss IPA on its own. The reason behind this is that IPA is very well constructed with defining the aims and objectives of the study.
Then somebody said, but I'm not sure if you did it already. Could you please show the slide that narrated the 3 ways of collecting the qualitative data again? But we will send the slides to everybody.
Yes, we will. That's true.
That's registered. Okay.
Yes. Normally in qualitative research, the conceptual theory adapted also informs the structure of the literature review, definitely. My question is, how do I explain or discuss the theory to make it align with the parts of the literature that resonates with my study? For instance, my study is looking at documentation and research data sharing. The study was inspired by the research data lifecycle. Do I discuss the entire model and place emphasis on the parts of interest to the study, or so in the end, with regards to your theory, make sure that in your interview framework that you kind of combine your theory with your research aims. And in that way, when you analyze it, you would kind of notice that if you do have a certain theory, that you would be able to identify the codes related to this theory. I hope I've answered that question. So just with regards to the social engineering, one of the participants or attendees has said that social engineering is used to manipulate people to disclose private information. It is typically used in fraud, getting someone to disclose their password and etc. So short answer would be no. Social engineering use techniques of manipulation to get people to disclose information they would typically not share with you. Probing would rather be part of a typical conversation to make sure that you understand their point of view, and if there is anything more about the conversation that you would like to know or share. Thank you, Herman, for that.
Then there's somebody that asked, can you do automatic coding in ATLAS exam? For example, basically, if you can word search across documents.
You are definitely able to do automatic search in ATLAS.ti, whereby you would be able to, for instance, say, in these documents that I've loaded up in, or that I've loaded into ATLAS.ti, how, or you would have a certain word and how many times does this word come up in the analysis. So when, with regards to auto coding, it's not going to auto code a phrase or a sentence or such. It's just going to code that word, and you would only be able to see how many times that word was used in the documents. So if you do not have access to any tools, I would suggest making use of Excel, for instance, because Excel you would be able to identify your codes, quotations, or for instance, you would be able to code in the margin by making use of Word. However, I do not suggest making use of these processes. It can become very overwhelming with all the data. So I do suggest that you do engage in software such as ATLAS.ti or in vivo.
Monique, Milton asked about the transcription rate per minute.
Please email me and then we can have a discussion about that. If I remember correctly, it's either 14 or 15 Rand. However, it all depends on your data. If you have an interview that is clear and has no disturbances, we might give you a discount. However, if it's not very clear, we would need to take additional times in order to transcribe the data correctly. All right, so I'm just quickly going to show my email address as well, just so that everybody has the information.
Monique, and everybody must please go to the website. Everything is there. The
Yes.
Online sessions for both of us, online workshops, everything is there.
Yes, that is correct. So that is my email. If you would like to contact me, you're more than welcome. You can also, like I said, book a Zoom session with either of us, and we would be able to, for instance, advise or assist where we can. And I think that is it for today. So if everybody has noted down the email, I'm just quickly going to close it now. Now I'm having difficulties getting back to the main screen.
So it's not only me. Yeah, if there's anybody that want to ask something, you're welcome. Yeah, and good luck with your research. Just please make sure, qualitative or quantitative, your design is correct before you go out and gather your data. Please.
Yes. So
somebody is asking about where the email is. I think in my presentation, the email is on the PDF that I will send through, and yours also, I think, Monique.
Yes.
So we will email through to. Okay, let me just put it in the chat. Also, I see somebody put it in the chat. And the recording will also be sent. The link to the recording will be sent to everybody also,
yes.
Together with the presentation.
Yes. So you guys can expect an email from us within the few days, whereby we would send you the link to the webinar. I would include all the slides, and also we would also include, for instance, the little discount we have on Henny's workshop, or not workshop, his online training, and you would also get a 20% discount from ATLAS.ti should you be interested. So I think we can conclude now. Thank you very much, everyone. And please do go like and follow our Facebook page. And if you want to give us a little bit of a review in order for our page to become more available to other people as well. I would really like to thank everyone for joining, and just pop an email if you have any questions. And good luck with your research process. Bye.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for attending.